Saving Guyenot, but Not Jesus, by Joe Atwill. Laurent Guyénot has written a critique of my work, Caesar's Messiah, entitled Save Jesus, Against Mythicism and Atwill's Theory. I wish to respond. In his article, Guyenot does not attempt any criticism of my actual analysis, which demonstrates that the Gospel story of Jesus was created to identify Titus Flavius as the Son of Man, that Jesus predicted would come with great destruction. Rather, he presents his understanding of the history of the era and maintains that this, in and of itself, negates my analysis. However, given that my theory is completely based upon the extant texts of the Gospels and Josephus, and not on any history, real or otherwise, of the era, one can only guess as to what parts of my analysis Guyenot sees his understanding of history as negating. As shown next, Guyenot's determination to avoid doing any real critique of my analysis is so fierce as to reach a literally absurd conclusion. Guyenot sees two major historical objections to my work. He wrote,
"The Flavian hypothesis raises two major objections. The first problem is with the chronology. Atwill's theory would begin to make sense if the historical record could document that the Flavians, rather than the Constantinians, were the first promoters of Christianity, or if the two dynasties were not separated by 2 centuries, roughly 8 generations, of imperial hostility to Christianity. Anyone claiming that some emperors before Constantine created, promoted, or just appreciated Christianity has to assert that they did so in secret."
It is self-evident that both the first-century Flavian Caesars and Constantine needed to keep the origin of the religion secret, so the fact that they did not publicly promote it is not a mystery, but to be expected. Further, Guyenot's claim that no emperor before Constantine publicly promoted Christianity is both irrelevant and incorrect. Emperor Gallienus issued an edict of toleration that formally ended all persecution of Christians, restored confiscated Christian property, churches, cemeteries, and effectively gave Christianity legal existence. This was 50 years before Constantine, and ushered in what is known by Catholic historians as the little piece of the church. Guyenot claimed that there is only the very small nail of the same name to link Flavius Constantine with the first-century Flavians. He wrote,
"Although the Constantinians are not related to the Flavians, a spiritual affiliation is not out of question, since members of the Constantinian dynasty, starting with Constantine's father, consistently bear the nomen Flavius. But that is a very small nail on which to hang the extraordinary claim of some Christian initiation secretly passed on for 2 centuries among crypto-Christian Romans within imperial families."
However, Constantine did more to create a spiritual filiation to the first-century Flavian emperors than just adopting their name. Guyenot seems unaware of the famous rescript of Hispellum, modern Spello in Umbria, Italy, discovered in the 18th century and dated to around 333 to 337 CE, during the reign of Emperor Constantine the Great. Sole ruler after 324, died 337. The inscription is one of the most important documents we have from Constantine's reign, and was intended to honor both the Flavian imperial dynasty, the first-century emperors Vespasian, Titus, and Domitian, from whom the Flavian family of the region claimed descent, and Constantine and his own dynasty. The key passage of the rescript, preserved on a stone inscription found in Spello, states that the people of Hispellum and the surrounding Umbrian towns were granted permission to build a temple to the gens Flavia, but with the explicit condition that it not be polluted by the deceit of any contagious superstition, that is, no blood sacrifices or traditional pagan rituals that Constantine disapproved of. Crucially, Constantine gives the dedication of the temple not merely to the gens Flavia, but specifically to his own gens Flavia, meaning Constantine himself had officially adopted the name Flavius and presented himself as the continuator and legitimate successor of the original Flavian dynasty. This is why scholars describe the temple as being dedicated to the gens Flavia, Constantini, or to the Flavian imperial family, in the broad sense that now included Constantine himself. Moreover, the temple was not the only known effort by Constantine to unify himself with the first-century Flavians. He intentionally sited and oriented slightly off-axis, by about 7 degrees from the Neronian grid, his famous arch on the Via Triumphalis to frame the Colossus of Sol, the enormous statue that depicted Vespasian as Sol Invictus through its central bay, thus creating a visual link to the earlier Flavian religious heritage. Constantine also incorporated stylistic elements from the Arch of Titus, for example, its single bay form and relief motifs as part of a broader homage to the earlier Flavian achievements. No historian has ever produced a coherent explanation as to why a zealous pagan like Constantine, who portrayed himself as Apollo, would have begun the process of making Christianity the state religion. Caesar's Messiah, however, offers such an explanation. Constantine chose the bizarre pseudo-Judaism because he knew that its scripture had been designed to cryptically worship Caesar. By claiming to be a Flavian, Constantine was, in effect, claiming to be a Christ of the religion. He demonstrated this to history with his mausoleum, where he surrounded his tomb with 12 cenotaphs, symbolic empty tombs or reliquaries, representing the 12 apostles. The symbolism cannot be mistaken. He wished to be seen, like the earlier Flavians, as the Messiah of Christianity. Guyenot's second historical problem with a Flavian origin of Christianity is also without any analytic meaning. He wrote,
The second problem with Atwill's Flavian hypothesis is the contradiction between the claim that Christianity was meant to convert the Jews and the reality that it ultimately converted the Romans.
Guyenot's logic fails him here, in that there is no contradiction in the Gospels being used for different purposes in different eras. I would note that over the millennium, Christianity has been used for many different purposes, including some that could not have even been imagined in the 1st or 3rd century, specifically the religion's promotion of Zionism in our era. Guyenot wrote,
If that is the case, then the Flavians' enterprise not only ended up in complete failure, few Jews were converted, and Jewish messianism erupted again in the 2nd century, but it actually backfired, since the few Jewish converts ended up converting the Gentiles.
While it is an obvious fact that Christianity failed in one of its missions in the 1st century, Guyenot needs to explain why this would impact the premise of the Flavians having produced the Gospels. They simply tried to calm down the Jews' messianic fury with a pacifistic version of Judaism and failed. Moreover, the Gospels succeeded on, at least in one of the goals, of the Flavian Caesars. The scripture inserted into history a legacy showing that they had not failed to become the God of the Jews.
Atwill would also need to explain why Christianity, instead of weakening Judaism, banned all Gentiles' religions except Judaism.
Here Guyenot at least asks an interesting question. While no one can answer it with certainty, and thus is hardly a weakness of my theory, I would conjecture that Rome recognized that it could not establish the second covenant, that is Christianity, as the foundation for its slave state, if it entirely got rid of the first. By choosing Christianity as the control device for the feudal system, Rome, in effect, condemned itself to at least recognizing the religion from which Christianity's scripture sprang. Thus, while Judaism was not banned, neither was it let free. Justinian I, for example, regulated the Jewish calendar and forbid oral traditions in synagogue readings. He closed some synagogues and turned others into Christian churches. and in North Africa and the Mediterranean islands, he temporarily forced baptism on Jews. Guyenot combines the two problems as if this would somehow make each proposition more difficult for my theory to explain. He wrote,
The two problems I have just mentioned are interconnected. What needs to be explained is both the 200 years it took for the Roman-made Christianity to become publicly promoted and the mystery of how, in that period, it switched from targeting the Jews to targeting the Romans.
This transformation is not hard to explain. The religion was often publicly promoted, though for different reasons, to suit the different political goals. In the 1st century, Rome's great problem was the rebellion of Messianic Jews. But in the 3rd century, Constantine wanted to use the religion as a mind control device for the feudal system. Guyenot attacks another straw man. He wrote,
What Christian Flavians? Atwill relies heavily on dubious and inflated circumstantial evidence. For example, he claims that his theory would explain why so many members of a Roman imperial family, the Flavians, were recorded as being among the first Christians. The Flavians would have been among the first Christians because, having invented the religion, they were in fact the first Christians. The so many Christian members of the Flavian imperial family are hypothetical at best. They are Flavia Domitilla, granddaughter of Vespasian, as well as her cousin and husband, Titus Flavius Clemens. But the tradition that they were Christians appears only in the 4th century under the pen of Eusebius of Caesarea. In earlier non-Christian sources, they are said to have been charged of atheism, like many others who drifted into Jewish ways. Cassius Dio, Roman History. If we understand Jewish to mean Christian, there remains the problem that Clemens and Domitilla's religious inclination was not in the taste of the emperor. Clement was executed and Domitilla was exiled together with members of her entourage. In other words, if they were Christians, as Atwill assumes, then their story contradicts Atwill's theory, and it takes a lot of nerves for him to pretend that it supports his theory.
Laurent Guyénot confuse a mystery that my analysis clears up. Why are so many mentions of Flavian Christians with the analysis itself and thereby creates a straw man to attack? I do not rely heavily or at all on the Christian Flavii as evidence for my theory. If they did not exist, I would not need to change a word of my analysis. Rather, they are simply a mystery that the theory clears up. However, the mystery is greater than what Guyenot claims. He only cites Flavia Domitilla and Titus Flavius Clemens, while the actual list of what have been called the Christian Flavii is much longer. Direct Flavian family members: Titus Flavius Clemens, consul, 95 AD, cousin of emperors Titus and Domitian, executed by Domitian in 95/96 AD on a charge of atheists, godlessness, and Jewish customs, Dio. Many modern scholars, for example Brian Jones, T.D. Barnes, John Granger Cook, and early Christian writers, Eusebius, Orosius, believed he was executed for Christian sympathies or outright conversion. Flavia Domitilla the Younger, daughter of the aforementioned Flavius Clemens, sometimes identified with the exiled Domitilla. Early Christian sources treat the family as Christian. Extended family / very close relatives: Titus Flavius Sabinus, consul 82, brother of Flavius Clemens, executed with Clemens. Sometimes grouped with him in the persecution of 95/96. A few scholars speculate he may have shared his brother's beliefs. High-ranking associates and court officials under the Flavians: Achilles Glabrio, consul 91 AD, of very noble birth, forced to fight in the arena and then executed by Domitian circa 95 AD. Suetonius and Dio say it was partly because he was accused of Jewish/atheist tendencies. Some scholars, for example Marta Sordi, Paul Carestes, have argued he was a Christian. Flavius Archippus, a philosopher from Prusa. Dio Chrysostom mentions a Flavius Archippus who was imprisoned under Domitian but later thanked by Nerva. A Christian inscription from the 3rd century calls a Flavius Archippus a confessor of the faith. Some identify the two: household employees, freedmen, and clients of the Flavians Stephanus, the steward, procurator of Flavia Domitilla, who assassinated Domitian in 96 AD. Later, Christian legend, Acts of Nereus and Achilles, 5th to 6th century, makes him a Christian and connects him to Domitilla's household eunuchs, Nereus and Achilles. Nereus and Achilles, traditionally said to have been eunuchs or servants in the household of Flavia Domitilla, martyred under Diocletian but placed in Domitian's time in legend. Their tomb and basilica on the Via Ardeatina link them to Domitilla. Petronilla, legendary daughter or spiritual daughter of Saint Peter, later connected in medieval tradition with the Flavian family, sometimes called Flavia Petronilla. Moreover, the Flavian dynasty left a mysteriously large footprint on not just the early literature, but the earliest geography of Christian Rome, so large as to require explanation, one that my work provides. Virtually all of the early Roman Christian churches, tituli, and the first cemetery or deaconry were directly linked to members or employees of the Flavian imperial family: Vespasian, Titus, Domitian, and especially Domitia Longina and Flavius Clemens. Here are the well-documented examples from the 2nd to 4th centuries that survived into the Middle Ages and still exist today. Titulus Clementis, today's Basilica of San Clemente. Traditionally founded in the house of Titus Flavius Clemens, Consul 95 CE, cousin of emperors Titus and Domitian, executed by Domitian in 96 CE. His wife Flavia Domitilla, niece of Domitian, is venerated as a saint and was exiled for her Christian faith. The 4th century basilica was built over a 1st century domus, that very early Christian tradition identified as the House of Clement, Pope Clement I, but which archaeology and ancient sources strongly associate with the Flavian family properties on the Caelian Hill. Catacomba di Domitilla, largest Christian catacomb in Rome, on the Via Ardeatina, belonged to Flavia Domitilla, the same niece exiled Christian mentioned above. She donated the land for Christian burials probably at the end of the 1st century. The nucleus of the catacomb contains frescoes from the late 1st, early 2nd century and explicit Flavian-era tombs, for example, the so-called Hypogeum of the Flavians. Titulus Equiti, today's Santi Silvestro e Martino ai Monti, or sometimes linked to San Martino ai Monti, founded by a presbyter named Equitius in the 3rd century, but the property originally belonged to a Roman eques, knight, called Equitius, who was a high-ranking freedman or employee of the Flavian emperors. The site was a large Flavian-era villa complex, Titulus Byzantis, or Byzantii, today Santi Giovanni e Paolo on the Caelian Hill, connected to a Christian named Byzans, or Pamachius in later tradition, but the underlying houses belonged to the imperial household under the Flavians. The area was heavily Flavian-owned property, near the palaces of the Flavians on the Palatine and Caelian. Santa Pudensiana. The Titulus Pudentius is traditionally linked to the senator Pudens, mentioned in 2 Timothy 4:21, whose daughters Praxedes and Pudentiana are venerated as saints. Some late sources claim Pudens was a freedman or client of the Flavian household, but this connection is weaker and more legendary. Basilica of Santi Nereo e Achilleo on the Via Appia, next to the baths of Caracalla, also has a direct and well-documented Flavian connection. The church stands inside the ancient Catacomba di Domitilla complex, the same huge Christian cemetery donated by Flavia Domitilla, niece of Domitian, at the end of the 1st century. The two saints Nereus and Achilles were, according to their late antique legend, Passio Sanctorum Nerei et Achille, 5th to 6th century, but based on older traditions, servants or soldiers of Flavia Domitilla herself. Guyenot then attempts to show that the two messianic candidates, the Flavian Caesars and Jesus Christ, are somehow incompatible, and that this indicates they did not originate in the same place. He wrote,
Josephus explained to his Roman readers that the Jews who had revolted against the Romans had misinterpreted an ambiguous prophecy from their scripture that one from their country should rule the entire world. The prophecy, Josephus now believed, applied in reality to Vespasian, who was made emperor in Judea, Jewish wars. Atwill correctly remarks, Josephus, in proclaiming himself God's minister, also described an ending of God's contract with the Judaism that was quite similar to the position that the New Testament takes concerning Christianity, the only difference being that Josephus believed that God's good fortune had gone over not to Christianity but to Rome and its imperial family, the Flavians. The similarity is due to the fact that Josephus and early Jewish Christians, including the Gospel writers, adhered to the same broad paradigm of Hellenistic Judaism. They were pro-Roman internationalist Jews who after 70 AD blamed the anti-Roman nationalist Jews for the catastrophe. Josephus and St. Paul's neo-messianic religions are very comparable. Each of them is seeking and finding a way to salvage the bedrock of Jewishness, Israel as God's chosen people, while giving up on Israel as an independent state and coming to terms with the unavoidable conclusion that God must have chosen Rome too. Each in their own way, they wanted to graft Jewish chosenness into the Romans' self-identity, but the difference is no less evident. Josephus proclaims Vespasian as the Messiah, while Jewish Christians voted for Jesus. The two theories are incompatible. The first theory was music to the Roman ears, and we find it repeated almost verbatim by both Tacitus and Suetonius in the early 2nd century. By contrast, the second theory that the Messiah was a Jew crucified by Roman authorities under the charge of sedition was not to the liking of Tacitus, Suetonius, or any other Roman author. Yet Atwill claims that Flavius Josephus, acting as a religious propagandist for his Flavian benefactors, promoted simultaneously both theories, one openly in his Jewish wars and the other anonymously in the Gospels. Insisting on the similarity of those two theories instead of their incompatibility, he uses Josephus' authorship of the first theory as an argument that Josephus also invented the second theory. Atwill justifies this by claiming that the two theories are in fact one and the same, since Josephus created the character Jesus as a cryptic reference to Titus, son of Vespasian.
Thus, Guyenot does not believe that both messiahs, Jesus and the Flavian Caesar, could have emerged from the Flavian imperial court because their political differences make them incompatible. In fact, the two bodies of literature that present the two messiahs could only have come from a single source, as they were designed to be interactive, as a careful reading of Josephus and the Gospels shows. The authors of the Gospels have Jesus foresee the coming of a Messiah greater than himself. And then they will see the Son of Man coming in clouds with great power and glory, and then he will send out the angels and gather his elect from the four winds, from the ends of the earth to the ends of heaven. Mark 13:26-27. The authors date the coming of this Messiah by stating that he will come before the generation alive during Jesus' ministry passes away, a generation being 40 years, or in other words, by 73 CE. They also confirm this date by describing specific events that occurred during the war, the razing of the temple and Jerusalem being encircled with a wall. The only individual in history the authors of the Gospels could be predicting is Titus Flavius, an individual whose court historians claimed that he was both the Son of God and the Jewish Messiah. All of this is overt and negates Guyenot's assertion that the Gospel authors saw their messiahs as incompatible with Josephus' claim that the Flavian Caesar was the Messiah. They also link the two messiahs in a cryptic way that proves both works emanated from a single source. The authors present Jesus as a human Passover lamb, thereby mirroring one of the events of the first covenant between God and the Jews, where the slaughter of the Passover lamb began the 40 years of wandering before the Israelites could occupy the Promised Land. Jesus is recorded in the Gospels as being sacrificed on Passover 33 CE. Josephus then subtly, but with clear intention, dates the conclusion of the war, the fall of Masada, to Passover 73 CE. Thus the Second Covenant had a miraculous mirroring of the first, wherein it was exactly 40 years to their day from the sacrifice of the Passover lamb to the date Rome would occupy all of the Promised Land. Since this understanding can only come from the reading of both works, their authors were in collusion and not incompatible. Guyenot then attacks another straw man. He wrote,
Roman conspiracy or Jewish conspiracy, because the core of his theory is that Jesus is a fictional avatar of Titus. Atwill stresses that Christianity is a Roman fabrication, and the title of his book mentions only a Roman conspiracy. But in the details, what he is envisioning is a Judeo-Roman conspiracy that involves not only the Flavians, but the Alexanders and the Herods, three families that shared a long-standing and intricate personal relationship that can be traced to the household of Antonia, the mother of the Emperor Claudius.
Guyenot then quotes from Caesar's Messiah.
In a convergence unique in history, the Flavians, Herods, and Alexanders brought together the elements necessary for the creation and implementation of Christianity. To produce the Gospels required a deep understanding of Judaic literature. The Gospels would not simply replace the literature of the old religion, but would be written in such a way as to demonstrate that Christianity was the fulfillment of the prophecies of Judaism and had therefore grown directly from it. Atwill provides no evidence whatsoever of the participation of the Alexanders in the writing of the Gospels, other than their familiarity with the Roman imperial families. And I consider as highly unlikely the participation of the Herods in creating a text that displays them in a very unflattering light.
I do not claim that I have uncovered evidence showing the actual authors of the Gospels. What I am pointing out in the paragraph above from my book that Guyenot quotes is that the three families were politically and financially linked, and that the real point I am making, which he for some reason edited out, is that the group had the capacity, motivation, and opportunity to have produced the Gospels, and that they are the only group of the era with such attributes. Guyenot moves on to the subject of Josephus. He wrote,
Let us therefore focus on the more intriguing case of Josephus. Atwill portrays him as a loyal agent of the Flavians who on their demand invented a fiction to deceive his people. But all the works of Josephus are clearly written by a proud and erudite Jew dedicated to enlightening Greek-speaking Romans about the greatness of his God-chosen nation. In his autobiography, Josephus asserts that he is working for God and only went to the Romans' side out of the conviction that Rome was God's instrument, by claiming that Vespasian was the Messiah, that is, by turning Jewish messianic prophecy on its head, he was not giving up on the superior destiny of the Jews. Like Philo of Alexandria before him, he was still claiming a very special place for his nation in God's providence.
Guyenot is again simply incorrect, and he does not appear to be familiar with the following passage from Josephus. This is a critical oversight, in that what Josephus is actually describing is the New Testament, the New Covenant. Josephus wrote, "And now, since all the ways out were blocked, and the city was burning, and the rebels were being slaughtered on every side, Josephus came into the midst of the people and spoke as follows, paraphrased in part, "We have long since been abandoned by God. The fortune, Dichi, that once belonged to the Jews has passed over, metavevican, to the Romans, and all the favor of God, Thea, has gone over to their side. For it is by the wrath of God that these things have come upon us, and it is because God has judged the Romans more worthy that he has granted them victory. Has not God himself made manifest that he has transferred his providence, pronoion, to the Romans and deserted our nation?" I would ask the reader to judge if there any way the above passage can be seen as Josephus claiming a very special place for his nation in God's providence. To prop up his notion that the received history makes the Flavian origin of Christianity unlikely, Guyenot asserts that Rome was not even the basis for the religion's spread. He wrote,
Conspiracy or no conspiracy, it was by Jews, not by Romans, that Christianity first spread like wildfire to all the big cities of the Roman Empire from Antioch to Rome.
Guyenot's notion of Jews spreading Christianity like wildfire is a total fantasy, and thus he can only provide the following for a citation. How did it happen? Acts 2:4-11 gives us a clue when we read that, by some miracle, the disciples spoke every language in the known world, so that they could start preaching to Parthians, Medes, and Elamites, people from Mesopotamia, Judea and Cappadocia, Pontus and Asia, Phrygia and Pamphylia, Egypt, and the parts of Libya round Cyrene, Cretans and Arabs, 2:9-11. While I have seen many examples of circular reasoning in my discussions on Caesar's Messiah, the use of the miracle of the disciples' glossolalia as evidence for Guyenot's fantasy of Jews spreading Christianity is perhaps the worst. Then, at last, Guyenot begins his analysis of Caesar's Messiah, though the onset is rather disappointing in that he begins it by stating that he will not do any. He wrote,
I will not discuss these parallels, which constitute the bulk of Atwill's book and are summarized in his video and his article.
A strange omission in that, if my analysis is correct, Guyenot can safely throw out his entire understanding of the history of Christianity. Thus, one would expect some curiosity. It is especially strange in that he does not deny the existence of such parallels. In any case, he rejects his refusal to discuss the parallels in the very next sentence and begins to discuss them. He wrote,
I do not deny that such parallels exist.
So far, so good. But then Guyenot seems to have a mental collapse claiming that
the Gospel writers did draw some parallels between Jesus' ministry in Jerusalem and the events that Jesus supposedly foresaw in Jerusalem some 40 years later is quite possible, but it is not proof that the Gospel writers were fashioning their fictional Jesus after the historical Titus.
But how can the Gospel writers be using events from the war as the basis for Jesus' ministry, not be proof that the Gospel writers were using events from the war as the basis for Jesus' ministry? He then goes on claiming,
some of the parallels listed by Atwill are therefore acceptable.
Of course, it's obvious that Guyenot should inform us as which ones he sees as acceptable and why. But in fact, I know why Guyenot doesn't, because I encounter the technique often in discussions with critics of Caesar's Messiah. What he is trying to do is avoid opening a train of thought that would expose his limited understanding of my analysis. Thus, he continued writing.
Others are non-existent or insignificant, in my opinion.
Again, which ones? What criteria is he using for these claims? Guyenot is not an idiot and is aware he is not able to produce any meaningful analysis of whether or not the parallels I presented in Caesar's Messiah create a typological prefiguration. He therefore attempts the following absurd sleight of hand, which he hopes will provide him with a camouflage for not doing the one thing his critique requires, producing some analysis negating mine. Guyenot claims that while a critique of the parallels is permitted, it could only produce a subjective judgment, and everyone can make his own. He continues with his subjective judgment with name-calling, referring to my work as ludicrous.
I think that the idea of the gospel as a satire or a joke on the Jews, and the idea that the joke was understood only by its authors until Atwill got it, are both ludicrous.
What is ludicrous is Guyenot's pretense that he is doing real analysis.
What is, however, an objective fact is that no one, according to Atwill, has been able to see them before him.
This is another straw man, in that I do not claim to have discovered all of the parallels, or that no one else ever saw any. For example, does Guyenot actually believe that I claimed to have discovered the parallel events of the temple being razed or the encircling of Jerusalem with a wall? What I recognized is that the parallels were occurring in the same sequence in both works, and that this demonstrated that one work was dependent on the other. An important example of another scholar seeing what I saw was Hugh Schonfield's analysis of the parallel between the crucifixion scenes in Josephus and the Gospels. Hugh Schonfield wrote The Passover Plot in 1965. In that book, and in some of his later writings, Schonfield drew a direct parallel between the crucifixion account in the Gospel of John, 1918-34, and a story told by the first-century Jewish historian Flavius Josephus in his autobiography, Vita. His analysis mirrored the one I would do of the passages 30 years later. At the time of my research, I had not read Schonfield's book, but I had an advantage that Schonfield did not. I knew where to look. I had discovered that Josephus and the Gospels had been wired together in terms of their sequence, so I knew exactly in Josephus's text where I would find his crucifixion parallel. Below is Schonfield's analysis. Readers of my book will recognize how precisely our two interpretations overlap. Schonfield came to realize that the Gospel of John's crucifixion scene contains deliberate echoes of a story from Josephus's history, and that the author of John had used it as a literary template. 1. Josephus. 3 men crucified together. John. There they crucified him, and with him 2 others, one on either side, and Jesus in the middle. Schonfield. Deliberate setup of 3 crucifixion victims. 2. Josephus's Vita. Josephus himself survives. John. Jesus survives, in Schonfield's theory, by being taken down early. Schonfield. Jesus equals the Josephus figure who lives 3. Josephus. 2 companions. One dies quickly, one lingers and dies, one lives on. John. The 2 thieves. Nothing explicit, but implied one might have lived longer. More importantly, Jesus is given a drugged drink and is taken down early. Schonfield. Symbolic or coded reference 4. Josephus. A physician treats the survivors. John. Joseph of Arimathea, a secret disciple, and Nicodemus, who earlier brought spices and later helps with burial, bring myrrh and aloes. Jesus' legs are not broken, spear wound, etc. Schonfield. Joseph of Arimathea and Nicodemus play the role of the physician accomplices. 5. Josephus. The 3rd man is treated and recovers. John. Jesus is removed from the cross while still alive, in Schonfield's reading, given drugs, vinegar plus gall hyssop, and secretly revived later. Schonfield. The entire Johannine crucifixion narrative is modeled on Josephus's own survival story, Josephus, whose original Jewish name was Yosef ben Mattityahu, Joseph son of Matthias, or often rendered Joseph bar Matthias. The name Joseph of Arimathea is suspicious. Arimathea has no clear location in Judea, known from other sources, and may be a cryptic or symbolic name. Schonfield suggests Arimathea could be derived from Ha-Ramathaim as a wordplay. I would improve on Schonfield's analysis in one way. He should have mentioned that both crucifixion stories occur toward the end of the narrative. In the greatest oversight in history, scholars have not attempted to understand if that the sequence of events of Jesus' ministry had a meaning. While I have not found his Bible criticism impressive, I have agreed with many of Guyenot's positions in his other articles, and I understand why he wants to resist the theory in Caesar's Messiah. He is concerned that it could be used to justify the militant Zionism that infects so many of our world's political systems. He actually overlays his understanding of present-day Zionism onto his attempts at Bible scholarship, amusingly calling Josephus's duplicity a PNAC strategy. He wrote,
I would call this the PNAC strategy, Project for the New American Century, in reference to today's crypto-Zionist neocons singing the tune of the American Century or America First, while subverting the empire for the benefit of their nation's imperial ambition.
I would point out that while his concern is justified, the real message of Caesar's Messiah is not one of justification for Zionism. It is just the opposite. I believe that the analyses of the New Testament I have done will be part of a process that finally puts sunlight on what is really behind all of the literature that has created the destructive Abrahamic traditions. In other words, Judaism, Christianity, and Islam will each have their foundational literature exposed as having been created by ancient oligarchs as war propaganda. Of course, many will see this idea as wistful thinking. However, I would note that I have already seen analyses of my work done with AI that suggests that armed with such a tool, scholars will soon be able to do the type of critique of the scriptures that will provide definite answers. Such an approach might save Guyenot, but not Jesus.